The icy waters of the Delaware River churned beneath the crude boats. As General George Washington stood at the bow, his weathered face set against the howling wind of December 25th, 1776. Behind him, 2,400 Continental soldiers huddled in the freezing darkness, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter night air. This was no ordinary Christmas crossing. This was a desperate gamble that would either save the American Revolution or end it. In catastrophic failure, just days earlier, the Continental Army had been in full retreat across New Jersey, pursued relentlessly by British forces under General Charles Cornwallis. The string of defeats in New York had left Washington's army demoralized, depleted, and on the verge of complete dissolution. Enlistments were expiring, supplies were dwindling, and the cause of American independence hung by the thinnest of threads. In the taverns of Philadelphia, politicians whispered of surrender. In London, King George III prepared proclamations of victory. Washington knew that without a decisive action, the revolution would die with the coming dawn of 1777. The Hessian garrison at Trenton, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, presented an opportunity, but only if Washington could achieve complete surprise. The German mercenaries, flushed with recent victories and confident in their professional superiority, had grown complacent in their winter quarters. As detailed in historical accounts from the American Battlefield Trust, the crossing began at 6 o'clock in the evening, with chunks of ice the size of millstones threatening to crush the Durham boats against the rocky shores. The nor'easter that had been building all day now unleashed its full fury, turning what should have been a 3-hour crossing into a 9-hour nightmare of endurance. Captain Alexander Hamilton, Washington's young aide-de-camp, watched in amazement as his commander maintained perfect composure despite the mounting dangers. Horses slipped and fell on the icy banks, artillery pieces threatened to overturn the boats, and several soldiers collapsed from exposure. Yet Washington pressed forward, knowing that retreat would mean the end of everything they had fought to. Achieved out by 3 o'clock in the morning, the last boat reached the New Jersey shore. The men were exhausted, soaked to the bone, and facing an 8-mile march through driving snow and sleet. 2 soldiers had already frozen to death during the crossing, and many others showed signs of severe frostbite. Washington mounted his horse and rode among his troops, his presence alone providing the encouragement they desperately needed. The march to Trenton began in complete silence, with the army divided into 2 columns to approach the town from different directions. Washington himself led the main force along the Pennington Road, while General Nathanael Greene commanded a smaller detachment that would attack from the north. The element of surprise was absolutely crucial. If the Hessians received even a moment's warning, the entire operation would collapse into bloody disaster. As dawn approached on December 26th, Washington could see the first houses of Trenton appearing through the swirling snow. The fate of the American Revolution now rested on the next few hours of combat, and every man in the Continental Army understood the stakes. This would not merely be another battle. It would be the moment that determined whether the United States of America would be born, or still born in the frozen fields of New Jersey. The streets of Trenton lay quiet, under a blanket of fresh snow, as Washington's Continental Army took their positions. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 26, 1776, the Hessian sentries, groggy from Christmas celebrations and confident in their invincibility, patrolled their posts with routine indifference. Colonel Johann Rall, commanding the garrison of 1,500 German mercenaries, had dismissed repeated warnings from loyalist informants about potential American movements, declaring that these country clowns posed no serious threat to professional European soldiers. Washington divided his force with military precision that would have impressed Frederick the Great himself. Captain Alexander Hamilton positioned his battery of artillery at the head of King Street, while Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, prepared his cavalry for a mounted charge. The plan was elegantly simple: strike hard, strike fast, and allow no enemy escape routes. Every Continental soldier understood that failure here would mean not just military defeat, but the complete collapse of American independence. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the first American artillery round thundered through the sleepy streets of Trenton, shattering windows and sending Hessian soldiers stumbling from their quarters in various states of undress. Hamilton's cannons, positioned with deadly accuracy, commanded both main streets of the town, making organized resistance nearly impossible. The surprise was so complete that many German soldiers initially believed they were under attack from their own artillery. firing accidentally in the confusion. Colonel Rahl, awakened by the thunderous bombardment, rushed from his headquarters still buttoning his uniform. The professional soldier, who had dismissed American military capabilities just hours earlier, now faced a nightmare scenario: his elite troops scattered, his defensive positions compromised, and enemy forces advancing from multiple directions. Simultaneously, the Hessians, despite their renowned discipline, found themselves trapped in a tactical vice that tightened with every passing minute. The battle raged through the narrow streets with unprecedented ferocity. American soldiers, their blood fired by months of retreat and defeat, fought with a desperation that transformed citizen farmers into effective warriors. Private John Greenwood, barely 18 years old, would later recall how the sight of Washington, himself riding through the gunfire, filled every Continental soldier with renewed courage. The general seemed to be everywhere at once, directing artillery fire, encouraging faltering units, and maintaining tactical control despite the chaos of urban warfare, as referenced in detailed military analyses from Mount Vernon's digital archives. The Hessians attempted several counterattacks, but Hamilton's artillery made every street a killing ground. The German professionals, trained for European-style open-field battles, found themselves completely unprepared for this new form of warfare that combined regular army tactics with frontier fighting skills. Their attempts to form traditional battle lines were shattered again and again by accurate American musket fire from concealed positions. By 9:30 in the morning, organized Hessian resistance had collapsed entirely. Colonel Rahl, mortally wounded while trying to rally his men, was carried dying from the field as his surviving soldiers threw down their arms in surrender. Washington had achieved the impossible complete victory against professional European troops, with minimal American casualties and nearly 1,000 enemy prisoners taken. The psychological impact of the Trenton victory reverberated far beyond the immediate tactical success. Word spread rapidly through the colonies that Washington's army had not only survived its darkest hour but had emerged triumphant. Enlistments that had been expiring by the hundreds were suddenly renewed. Continental currency, nearly worthless just days before, began recovering its value as confidence in American independence was restored. But Washington understood that one victory, however spectacular, would not be enough to secure the revolution. British forces under General Cornwallis were already marching from New York to recapture Trenton and crush the Continental Army once and for all. The next few days would determine whether the miracle at Trenton would be remembered as the turning point of the revolution or merely as its last desperate gasp before final defeat. News of the stunning American victory at Trenton reached British headquarters in New York like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. General William Howe, comfortable in his winter quarters and confident that the rebellion was all but extinguished, suddenly found himself facing an entirely new strategic reality. The defeated Continental Army had not only survived, but had dealt a humiliating blow to British prestige that resonated throughout Europe. King George III's professional German allies had been routed by colonial farmers of development that threatened to transform the American rebellion into a global conflict. Lord Charles Cornwallis, hastily recalled from his planned voyage to England, assembled a formidable force of 8,000 British and Hessian troops to recapture Trenton and destroy Washington's army once and for all. The Earl, veteran of numerous European campaigns and confident in his tactical abilities, viewed the American victory as nothing more than a lucky surprise attack against unprepared enemies. This time, there would be no element of surprise, no undefended garrison, and no escape for the troublesome colonial general who had embarrassed the crown. Washington, meanwhile, faced an agonizing strategic dilemma. His victory at Trenton had, indeed, restored American morale and prevented the immediate collapse of the revolution, but it had also painted a massive target on his army's back. Every British and German soldier in New Jersey now burned for revenge, and Cornwallis commanded overwhelming numerical superiority. The sensible military decision would be to retreat across the Delaware River and preserve what remained of the Continental Army for future operations. But Washington possessed a quality that set him apart from conventional military thinking: an intuitive understanding of the revolution's psychological dimensions. He recognized that another retreat, no matter how tactically justified, would shatter the fragile confidence that Trenton had restored. The American cause needed visible proof that the Continental Army could stand and fight against British regulars, not merely strike and run like frontier raiders. On December 30th, 1776, Washington made one of the most crucial decisions in American military history. Instead of retreating to safety, he chose to remain in Trenton and face Cornwallis's advancing army. This decision required extraordinary courage, as it meant risking the complete destruction of the Continental Army and with it, American independence itself on a single battle. The general's first challenge was keeping his army together long enough to fight. Enlistments for many Continental soldiers expired on December 31st, and these men had already served far beyond their original commitment. Washington personally addressed each regiment, appealing not only to their patriotism, but to their sense of personal honor. In a scene that would become legendary in American military folklore, he offered a $10 bounty to every man who would extend his service for just 6 more weeks. As documented in historical records from the Princeton Battlefield Society, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Veteran soldiers who had endured months of defeat, retreat, and hardship chose to remain with their beloved commander for what might well be their final battle. The army that stayed with Washington in Trenton was small, barely 5,000 effective troops, but it was composed entirely of volunteers who had chosen to risk everything for American independence. Cornwallis advanced methodically from Princeton, his professional army moving with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. British light infantry probed American positions, German artillery trained on defensive works, and cavalry patrols sealed every potential escape route. The Earl had learned from the Hessian defeat at Trenton there would be no surprises this time, no opportunities for clever tactical maneuvers, just the grinding application of superior numbers and firepower. By the evening of January 2nd, 1777, Cornwallis had positioned his army on the heights north of Trenton, with the Assunpink Creek forming a natural barrier between the opposing forces. The British commander, confident in his overwhelming advantages, decided to postpone his final assault until the following morning. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential mistakes in British military history. As darkness fell over the frozen fields of New Jersey, both armies prepared for what everyone expected would be the decisive battle of the American Revolution. Washington knew that conventional tactics would result in certain defeat. His amateur soldiers could not withstand a direct assault from Cornwallis's veterans. But the American commander had one final stratagem, so audacious and unexpected that it would either secure American independence or end his military career in complete disgrace. The British campfires flickered like fallen stars across the frozen landscape as General Cornwallis settled into his headquarters tent on the night of January 2nd. 1777, his 8,000 troops, positioned on the commanding heights north of Trenton, formed an iron semicircle around Washington's trapped army. Every military principle suggested that the American position was hopeless. Caught between the Assunpink Creek and overwhelming enemy forces, the Continental Army faced certain destruction at daybreak. Cornwallis, veteran of countless European campaigns, saw no need for a costly night assault when dawn would bring easy victory. Inside the Thomas Clark House, serving as Washington's temporary headquarters, the American command staff faced their gravest crisis. Major General Nathanael Greene, the Army's most trusted strategist, studied crude maps by candlelight, while Artillery Chief Alexander Hamilton calculated ammunition supplies with grim precision. Every tactical analysis reached the same inevitable conclusion: a frontal battle against Cornwallis would result in complete annihilation of the Continental Army and the effective end of American independence. Washington himself remained outwardly calm, but those closest to him could see the enormous weight of responsibility pressing upon his shoulder. At 44 years of age, the Virginia planter had become the living embodiment of American resistance to British rule. His personal fate was inseparable from that of the Revolution itself. If Washington fell at Trenton, the cause of independence would likely die with him. But as midnight approached, Washington unveiled a plan so audacious that it bordered on madness. Instead of attempting a hopeless frontal attack or an equally doomed retreat, he proposed something that violated every rule of conventional warfare. Abandoning the Trenton position under cover of darkness and marching his entire army around Cornwallis's flank to attack the lightly defended British supply base at Princeton. The maneuver would require perfect timing, absolute silence, and extraordinary luck. Any one of dozens of potential disasters could result in the Continental Army being caught in the open and destroyed piecemeal. The logistical challenges alone seemed insurmountable. Artillery pieces weighing hundreds of pounds would need to be moved cross-country on frozen ground, Without making noise that might alert British sentries, 5,000 soldiers would have to march 15 miles in complete darkness over unfamiliar terrain, maintaining formation and discipline despite exhaustion and bitter cold. Most critically, the entire operation would need to be completed before dawn revealed the American movement to enemy observers. Greene and Hamilton exchanged glances that conveyed both admiration and terror at their commanders' audacity. This was not merely a risky military maneuver, it was a desperate throw of the dice, with American independence as the stakes. Yet both officers recognized that Washington had correctly identified their only chance for survival, much less victory. As referenced in military histories from George Washington's Mount Vernon. The preparation began immediately with clockwork precision. Teamsters wrapped wagon wheels in cloth to muffle their sound, while sappers cleared obstacles from the planned route of march. The Army's few remaining horses were reserved for artillery transport, meaning that even senior officers would make the journey on foot through the freezing New Jersey countryside. The deception measures implemented were equally crucial to the planned success. A skeleton force of Pennsylvania militia, commanded by Colonel Edward Hand, would remain in Trenton to maintain campfires and create the illusion of normal Army activity. These brave men understood that if the ruse failed, they would almost certainly be captured or killed. When Cornwallis discovered the American withdrawal, at 1 o'clock in the morning of January 3, 1777, the Continental Army began its most perilous movement since crossing the Delaware. Washington himself rode at the head of the column, personally ensuring that every unit maintained proper spacing and discipline. Behind him stretched a line of soldiers, artillery, and supply wagons that extended for nearly 2 miles through the frozen darkness. The first few hours of the march proceeded with supernatural quiet, broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ground and the occasional whispered command from officers. Washington had impressed upon every man the absolute necessity of silence. A single musket dropped, a wagon wheel striking a stone, or even loud conversation could alert British patrols and doom the entire operation. As dawn approached, the stakes of Washington's gambit became crystal clear. If Cornwallis discovered the American withdrawal before the Continental Army reached Princeton, the British would be able to pursue and destroy the isolated American force with overwhelming superiority. But if the maneuver succeeded, Washington would achieve something unprecedented in military history, turning certain defeat into potential victory through pure audacity and tactical genius. The first pale light of January 3, 1777, revealed an extraordinary sight. To the British sentries posted around Trenton, smoke still rose from the American campfires across the Sunpink Creek, and the usual morning sounds of a waking army echoed from the enemy positions. Lord Cornwallis, confident in his overwhelming tactical advantages, allowed his troops an unhurried breakfast before beginning what he expected would be the final assault against Washington's trapped forces. The British commander had no way of knowing that he was preparing to attack empty positions. The Continental Army had vanished into the frozen New Jersey countryside like morning mist. Meanwhile, Washington's exhausted soldiers were completing one of the most audacious flanking movements in military history. The 15-mile night march had pushed men and equipment to their absolute limits, but the gamble appeared to be succeeding as the Continental Army approached Princeton from an unexpected direction. They encountered only light resistance from scattered British patrols who were unprepared for a major enemy force, appearing where none should have been possible. Princeton itself was defended by approximately 1,200 British troops, under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, a competent officer who had established his headquarters in the college town. Without expecting serious combat, most of Mawhood's force consisted of the 17th Foot Regiment, professional soldiers with extensive combat experience, but they were dispersed throughout the town and surrounding area rather than concentrated for battle. This dispersion, tactically sound for garrison duty, would prove disastrous when faced with Washington's surprise attack. The initial contact occurred around sunrise, when American advance guards encountered a British foraging party south of Princeton. Captain Alexander Hamilton, commanding the Continental Army's lead artillery battery, immediately unlimbered his guns and began a devastating bombardment that caught the British completely off guard. The thunderous cannon fire, echoing across the frozen fields, announced to both armies that the impossible had occurred. Washington had escaped Cornwallis's trap and was attacking Princeton with his main force. Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, a veteran of European campaigns and a capable tactical commander, attempted to organize an immediate counterattack with the forces at his disposal. The 17th Foot, despite being caught by surprise, formed battle lines with professional precision and advanced against the American positions. With bayonets fixed, for several crucial minutes, the outcome remained in doubt as British regulars clashed with Continental troops who were exhausted from their night march, but inspired by the audacity of their commander's strategy. The turning point came when Washington himself appeared on the battlefield, mounted on his white charger and presenting an unmistakable target for enemy marksmen. According to detailed accounts preserved at Mount Vernon's historical archives, the general rode directly between the opposing battle lines, completely exposed to fire from both sides, rallying his troops through personal example rather than shouted commands. This display of courage, witnessed by hundreds of soldiers from both armies, transformed an uncertain tactical situation into an American triumph. The British line, already shaken by the unexpected attack and the sight of enemy artillery commanding their positions, began to waver when they witnessed Washington's extraordinary personal bravery. Professional soldiers, trained to respect courage above all other military virtues, found their own resolve undermined by the obvious fearlessness of their opponent. When American infantry, inspired by their commander's example, launched a coordinated assault supported by Hamilton's accurate artillery fire, British resistance collapsed with shocking suddenness. Lieutenant Colonel Mahood, wounded in the fighting and realizing that his scattered force could not hold Princeton against a determined enemy attack, ordered a general withdrawal toward Cornwallis's main army. The retreat quickly became a rout as American cavalry, commanded by Captain William Washington, pursued the fleeing British troops with relentless efficiency. Within 2 hours of first contact, Washington had achieved a complete tactical victory that captured Princeton, secured enormous quantities of British supplies, and dealt another devastating blow to enemy morale. The psychological impact of the Princeton victory exceeded even its tactical significance. Word spread rapidly through the colonies that Washington's army had not merely survived Cornwallis's trap, but had turned certain defeat into spectacular triumph. The general, who had been dismissed by British commanders as an amateur planter, had demonstrated tactical genius that compared favorably with the greatest military minds of Europe. But even as his soldiers celebrated their remarkable success, Washington understood that the greatest danger still lay ahead. Cornwallis, upon discovering the American escape, would be marching toward Princeton with overwhelming force, burning for revenge against the colonial general, who had repeatedly humiliated British arms. The next few hours would determine whether Washington's audacious gamble would secure American independence or merely delay its ultimate defeat. The thunderous roar of cannon fire rolling across the New Jersey countryside at dawn struck General Cornwallis like a physical blow. From his headquarters tent outside Trenton, the British commander could immediately identify the distinctive sound of field artillery, engaged in serious combat, but the direction was completely wrong. The guns were firing from Princeton, not from the American positions across Assunpink Creek, where his trapped enemy should have been, awaiting destruction. In an instant of horrifying clarity, Cornwallis realized that Washington had achieved the impossible. The Continental Army had vanished from an encircled position and was attacking British forces 15 miles away. The discovery of the American deception triggered a fury in Cornwallis that would be remembered by his subordinates for decades. The professional soldier, who had dismissed colonial military capabilities, found himself repeatedly outmaneuvered by a Virginia planter with no formal military education. The Earl's reputation, built through years of European campaigns, now hung in the balance as news of Washington's escape spread throughout the British Army. Every officer and enlisted man understood that their commanding general had been thoroughly deceived by an enemy he had publicly declared to be militarily incompetent. Within minutes of confirming the American withdrawal, Cornwallis ordered his entire force to march immediately toward Princeton. 8,000 British and Hessian troops, many still finishing their breakfast, formed columns on the frozen roads with professional efficiency. Despite their commander's obvious agitation, the Earl understood that if Washington escaped again, British control over New Jersey would collapse entirely, potentially dragging the entire war effort into prolonged stalemate. The forced march toward Princeton pushed both men and animals to their absolute limits. Cornwallis, desperate to catch Washington before the Americans could establish defensive positions, maintained a punishing pace that left stragglers scattered along the route. Artillery pieces, essential for any assault against prepared enemy positions, slowed the advance considerably as horses struggled on icy roads and equipment broke down under the strain of rapid movement. Meanwhile, Washington faced an agonizing decision that would determine the fate of American independence. His stunning victory at Princeton had achieved everything he had hoped. Enemy supplies captured, British morale shattered, and American confidence restored, but his exhausted army now faced the immediate prospect of being caught by Cornwallis's superior force. Every military principle argued for immediate retreat to avoid a catastrophic confrontation against overwhelming odds. But Washington recognized that his strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The twin victories at Trenton and Princeton had transformed the Continental Army from a defeated rabble into a genuine threat to British control over New Jersey. More importantly, these successes had restored American credibility both domestically and internationally, opening possibilities for foreign assistance that could ultimately secure independence. The key was preserving his army while maintaining the psychological momentum that recent victories had created. As detailed in historical analysis from the American Battlefield Trust, Washington's solution demonstrated the same audacious thinking that had characterized his entire campaign. Instead of retreating directly across the Delaware River, where Cornwallis might trap him against the water barrier, the American commander chose to march north toward Morristown, a mountainous region that offered natural defensive positions and proximity to vital supply lines from New England. The race toward Morristown became one of the most dramatic pursuits in military history. Cornwallis, his professional pride wounded and his strategic position threatened, drove his troops with relentless determination. The British advance guard, composed of light infantry and cavalry, maintained visual contact with the American rear guard for several hours, threatening to bring on a general engagement that would likely result in Continental Army destruction. Washington himself rode with the rear guard, personally ensuring that his army's withdrawal remained orderly despite the constant pressure from pursuing enemies. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery, positioned at strategic points along the route, repeatedly delayed British advance elements with accurate fire. That forced Cornwallis to deploy his main force rather than continue the pursuit with light troops alone. The critical moment came as both armies approached the crossroads that would determine their ultimate destinations. If Cornwallis could force a battle before Washington reached the defensive terrain around Morristown, British numerical superiority would almost certainly prove decisive. But if the Americans could maintain their disciplined withdrawal for just a few more hours, they would reach positions where terrain would neutralize much of the enemy's advantage. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the frozen New Jersey landscape, the outcome of Washington's most audacious campaign hung in the balance. The general, who had transformed certain defeat into stunning victory, now faced his greatest test, preserving the Continental Army while maintaining the strategic initiative that recent successes had won. The next few hours would determine whether the American Revolution would continue as a viable struggle for independence or collapse in the final, irreversible defeat. The winter sun cast long shadows across the Morristown Hills as Washington's Continental Army reached the defensive positions that would preserve both their immediate survival and the long-term prospects of American independence. Behind them, Cornwallis's pursuing force had finally halted, recognizing that the difficult terrain and approaching darkness made further advance both tactically dangerous and strategically pointless. The great chase was over, and against all reasonable expectations, the Americans had escaped with their army intact and their morale transformed. In the space of 10 extraordinary days, from December 26, 1776, through January 3, 1777, Washington had achieved what historians would later recognize as one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. The general, who had been written off as an amateur, had outmaneuvered professional British commanders twice, winning decisive victories that restored American confidence and fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Revolutionary War. The immediate tactical results were impressive enough: nearly 1,500 enemy casualties and prisoners, enormous quantities of captured supplies, and the complete restoration of American control over western New Jersey. But the psychological and political consequences far exceeded these material gains. Throughout the colonies, militia units that had dissolved after early defeats began reforming with renewed enthusiasm. Continental currency, nearly worthless just weeks before, regained much of its value as confidence in ultimate American victory was restored. Perhaps most Significantly, the victories at Trenton and Princeton demonstrated to European observers that the American Revolution represented a serious military challenge to British power, rather than merely a colonial rebellion doomed to inevitable failure. In Paris, Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes began seriously considering formal French assistance to the American cause. In Berlin, Frederick the Great expressed grudging admiration for Washington's tactical abilities, comparing them favorably to those of Europe's most accomplished generals. The British response revealed the full extent of Washington's strategic success. General Howe, previously confident that the rebellion would collapse before spring, now found himself forced to completely revise his strategic planning. The comfortable assumption that British professional superiority would quickly overwhelm colonial resistance had been shattered by the demonstrated competence of continental forces. Under inspired leadership, instead of preparing victory proclamations, British commanders now faced the prospect of a prolonged war, requiring significant additional resources and manpower. Cornwallis himself, despite his failure to destroy Washington's army, had gained new respect for his opponent's abilities. The Earl's dispatches to London abandoned the dismissive tone that had characterized earlier British assessments of American military capabilities. Washington, previously described as a lucky planter, was now acknowledged as a formidable adversary whose tactical innovations posed genuine threats to British strategic objectives. As documented in comprehensive military studies from Princeton Battlefield Society archives, the campaign's impact extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. Washington had demonstrated that American forces, properly led and motivated, could defeat European professional armies in conventional battle. This revelation transformed the Revolution from a desperate struggle for survival into a viable war for independence with realistic prospects of ultimate success. The personal transformation of Washington himself was equally significant. The Virginia planter, who had begun the war with limited military experience, had emerged as a strategic genius capable of complex operations requiring perfect coordination between multiple military branches. His willingness to risk everything on audacious gambles, combined with meticulous attention to operational details, established a leadership style that would characterize American military excellence for generations to come. For the soldiers of the Continental Army, the 10 crucial days had forged a new sense of professional identity and national purpose. Men who had endured months of defeat and retreat now understood that they belonged to a military organization capable of achieving victory against the world's most powerful empire. This psychological transformation would prove as important as any tactical advantage in sustaining the Revolution through the difficult years that lay ahead. As 1777 began, the American cause had been fundamentally transformed by Washington's bold moves. The Revolution that had seemed doomed to failure just weeks before now possessed credible military leadership, restored popular confidence, and realistic prospects for foreign assistance. The Battle of Princeton, climaxing Washington's extraordinary campaign, had indeed changed revolutionary history not through a single dramatic engagement, but through the cumulative impact of strategic vision, tactical brilliance, and extraordinary personal courage applied at the precise moment when American independence hung in the balance. The general who crossed the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776, had saved not merely his army, but the very possibility of American freedom itself.